from Quite the Thing Media.
This is Danny Brown from Podcaster Stories, and you're listening to Indie Podcaster, where Jeff, aka Podcast Father, features content creators and the great things they're doing. By sharing what they're passionate about, Jeff helps influence, highlight and promote creators, artists and more. Join Jeff and his guests on their Indie Podcaster journey.
You've been searching for a podcast. Want to know about some great artists? You've come to the right place. Indie Podcaster with your host, the Podcast Father.
We're still rocking and rolling here on Indie Podcaster. I'm your host, Jeff, aka Podcast Father. Leah Jones from She Will Rock You Podcast joins me. You like how I connected that in there? That was pretty damn cool.
We're rocking and rolling.
We are around the clock. I'm getting really old by saying things like that. Maybe that's not the best reference. I've always been jealous of Elvis and the moves that he could make with his hips. I call myself Jevis. But anyway, we are going to talk about your podcast for a minute, because I do like to do that every episode for the indie podcasters that are joining me for these intros. I do love your podcast, but you love it even more because it's your podcast. So I'll let you talk about it for a second.
Yes, my podcast. Beth Ann and I, my co-host, and I refer to it as our child. We are a bi-weekly rock history podcast where the two of us take turns telling the other one the life history of an artist. And we do it in a way that's not just like reading you a Wikipedia article where it's going to bore you to death. We have fun with it. Sometimes it gets a little sad because there's a lot of death in rock and roll, but we do have a good time.
You do, and you highlight some of the things that aren't as known. So it is good. I encourage everybody to check out She Will Rock You Pod. They're also my friends and pals. They joined me at Quite the Thing Media not too long ago, so we've been excited about that.
Yes, happy to be here and add some estrogen to the team.
Cheers, mates, right? Today, we're going to share an interview with you. I had a conversation with Jason, aka Agent Palmer, Palmer Files Pod. Have you had a chance to check in to Agent Palmer?
Yes.
Isn't it a great nickname, Agent Palmer?
I've, ever since getting into podcasting, realized that my online alias is very weak compared to a lot of people. I wish I'd come up with a cool name like that. But I did creep on his Twitter profile, and he looks like he knows a lot about podcasting.
He does know quite a bit. He has a pretty cool story because he actually started out with a blog, and he built from that, and he got involved with podcasting, but kind of like a way that a lot of people, no offense to yourself, because you're extremely newer at it. He kind of got involved in the behind the scenes stuff, like producing it for people that he knew, and then more or less kind of getting in on a consistent co-host guest sort of role before actually starting his own podcast, the Palmer Files podcast. So he kind of went through all the motions that a lot of people don't necessarily do these days. Maybe
we should have done that. We just jumped in and started recording on a laptop in a basement.
I don't think, there's nothing wrong with that, except for you telling me the story about the acoustics in the basement, how terrible they were. But I think you got to start out somewhere. But it's cool that he went through all the steps, and he's also been there as it's kind of the second round of audio content boom that's happened in the last 6 years. He's been a part of that whole timeline, which is pretty cool.
That's super cool.
Super freaky, is that what you said?
No, I said super cool.
Gotcha. You sound like you've just been on an all-night shenanigans or something. Exhaustion.
I don't know why my voice just fell off at the end of that phrase. I'm not actually that tired tonight.
But seriously, though, Agent Palmer is a great resource for the podcasting community. He's been great. He's been a person that I've gone to, and we've chatted about various things. He's a really good follow on Twitter, and just a really good person to, build a relationship with if you want to learn more about podcasting. That's a great thing to say about somebody for sure.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited to listen to it.
Let's go ahead and get the listening going. But before we do that, give me just a few minutes to tell you about some stuff that you're going to love.
You didn't say business.
This podcast lives on engagement from you listeners. I absolutely love all of you. And if you aren't already, please do contact me. You can do that on Twitter at podcast_father or by email the podcastfather@gmail.com. Also have a little contact section on my website, podcastfather.com. If you'd be so kind to, you can leave a review on Apple Podcast or whatever podcast platform you listen to your podcast on. This podcast and myself are proud members of Quite the Thing Media. Quite the Thing Media, a community-based podcast network full of all independent content creators. Podcasts that speak to you. So make sure you check it out, quitethethingmedia.com. All the music on this podcast is credited to the independent artist Young Cart. So check it out, youngcartbeats.com. We've got some amazing sponsors on this podcast, and one of them is Podpage, the perfect place to make your podcast website. All of the link trees are great and all, but it doesn't really get you that CEO that you need, that digital trail that's also critical when you're a content creator. What do you want people to find when they search your podcast? It's very important to have an actual real podcast website, and the WordPresses are so difficult to set up and use. No. Podpage is the way to go. Tons of integrations make this a super easy process. So many different great features. You can range from packages for free clear up to the ones with all the gifts and gadgets that are incredible. But regardless, this is a simple way to make your podcast website. I'll tell you what, you go on podpage.com right now, you use the promo code FATHER in all caps, you get $20 off the package of your choice. Podpage.com. Indie Drop-In is a fantastic thing and a great sponsor of this podcast. Are you a podcaster that has a true crime, paranormal, scary, or even a comedy podcast, and you want to drop it in a legitimate feed and gain new listenership? Man, I tell you what, Indie Drop-In is a great resource for that. You can be featured in an episode. Your product can go out on an established podcast feed with established listeners already. Make sure you get online on indiedropin.com/creators and check it out. All right, now that fun is all over, let's jump into this interview and have a hell of a good time doing it. It's going to be an awesome interview today. I have Jason with me, or as I'm going to call him, Agent Palmer. What's up, Jason? Agent Palmer. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Most people know me as Agent Palmer, so I'm okay with it. I'm used to it. I've been Palmer for, well, the blog turns 10 this year, right? So I've been Agent Palmer for a decade. Call me what you will.
Any relation to Laura Palmer? You catch that reference at all? Twin Peaks?
I do. There's also, and I always forget, but there's a character on NCIS that is a slightly recurring character. So when that show goes off the air, I will be the number one Palmer in searches, at least until I stole the name from the Ipcress File movie starring Michael Caine, and they're remaking it. So I'm sure I will get knocked off the number one spot when that series releases.
Damn, man, you already beat me to one of the questions. No, anyway, we're podcasters. We like to talk. I'm going to give you a minute to tell everyone about yourself. I know I could say you started with the blog, yada, yada, yada. But like I said, we all like to talk. So I will give you the honor.
Yeah, I'm a blogger turned proxy caster turned podcaster. And I like to talk to people, just like I like to consume media, books, television, what have you. And so I write about any and everything that I enjoy, and I talk to as many different people about anything, really. The Palmer Files is my podcast, and it's just a conversational show. So I am all set up for like, hey, how you doing? And that kind of thing. And it's a little more structured than I give it credit for, but I have no control over where any of it goes. So my favorite example is episode 5, which is actually going to be replaced by an episode that I've recorded that has not been released yet. But I had someone on to talk about health and wellness as a general topic, and we just took a left turn and just started talking about all the unhealthy things and unhealthy lifestyles that teenage us did, and our mutual experiences, despite the fact that we didn't grow up together. I'm here for it. Like, just getting a cup of coffee in a diner or something.
And I think it's the cool thing about your podcast, because like, I think everybody kind of wants a podcast where they can just kind of talk about whatever the hell they want by week to week. It's a very hard thing to make work, and you've done that. So I give you credit for that one, man.
Well, thanks. I'd like to say a labor of love, but really it was like a happenstance thing. Like the blog's 10, the podcast is only 2, but I've been in and around podcasting for like 6 or 7 years. And I've been on them as a guest or like a producer behind the scenes for like 6 or 7. So I knew, like, by the time I finally decided to launch and I was done with when are you going to launch? When are you going to have your own show? I had a fairly good idea of what I wanted to do, but I had learned from my blog. I mean, my blog is of all things geek, but it's sports geek and movie geek and book geek and like comic geek and any kind of geekness that you can come up with, which is basically everything now. And I love that blog because I don't have to be in one topic, in one genre. The blog would not be turning 10 if I only did books or I only did movies, or, you know what I mean? So having learned from that, like, this is amazing, this is fun, I couldn't do a podcast. I mean, I went down the ideas, right? Like, it was like, oh, do I do a podcast about just this or just that? And it's like, I want this to be ongoing. I don't want to have an end. And right now, because I can talk to anybody about anything, it just seems like it will go on forever.
That's the way to leave it open. But I want to get back to your podcasting and blog. But first of all, just to explain to everybody the type of guy you are, I actually met you in the last, it's been several months ago now. You know, we've remained close since, but I actually met you because you were supporting me very early on with what I was doing. I think I first realized it when you had added me to a list on Twitter, like a podcast. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but your list is called, but
it's the podcast news list, and it's not really podcast news, but it is. And I created that because a few years ago, I was honored to be invited on as the co-host of the Podcast Digest, which I believe at some point, like Dan, it's always Dan's show. It's Dan's show no matter what I do. I'm just happy to be invited on. I believe I will be able to convince him to maybe come back or, do something again. But because of that, I was woefully under informed about the space. And so I created a list because that's the way I function best. And then it was just like, all right, what's going on? And while the show is on hiatus right now, like, I still like to be informed and see what's going on. And Jeff, I don't know if it's like this for you, but I'm sure it is for the listeners. And I'm sure it is for you too. When people find out you have a podcast or that you're in the space, they expect that you know everything. Like, oh, well, my friend's got one, or, oh, my favorite by far was somebody was like, well, then you must know Mark Maron. I'm like, no, like that's not how the space works. But I like to make sure I'm informed, and anybody who's sharing information, whether it's Ariel that's marketing based, or like some places that are just straight up pod news, like so-and-so, like Wondery got bought or sold, or before Rogan took the Spotify thing, when there were rumors that he might move. It's a weird, wild, fun space to kind of just keep track of. And I'm not going to claim that my list is comprehensive, but when I see people that are sharing similar things, that on the list you go.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool, because how do you discover somebody like in the first place and add them to that? That's how I was kind of, I mean, I started on this project like 5 months ago. So when you added me, I was like, man, that was kind of like the first thing. I was like, well, somebody's recognizing what I'm doing. Don't know how he discovered me, but people out there are watching and appreciate it. So that was a feel good moment, I guess you could say.
I'm a big fan of TweetDeck, and I will squat on hashtag podcast or hashtag pod news or hashtag indie podcast. Like, I rotate. I already have too many columns on my TweetDeck as it is. I mean, TweetDeck, if you have enough columns, you have to scroll to the right a long way. So I keep a podcast one within view on my monitor. So it's, that's kind of how it is. And then I have a legit podcast list column that I use. But just squatting on some of those other hashtags is a good way to just kind of see what's going on. Like, yeah, there's a lot of spam, but you can still, with a little bit of practice, go scroll for like a minute and go, oh, that's okay. That's worth keeping, or that's somebody worth keeping an eye on. So you check the button.
Talk to us about when you started this blog and why you started it. And what did you do before that kind of built up to it?
Well, the blog was an experiment because I had to write for my first professional job out of college after spending way too long in retail. And it had been since college that I had done any writing at all. And I was going to have to, do some writing and some blogging for my corporate gig. So it was like, I should do this just because I know writing is like a bike or running. Like the more you do it, the better you get. Like you never forget, but you need the practice. So that's why I started that. And, it comes and it goes in the beginning, but then I think by about year 3, I settled into a rhythm and I wanted to challenge myself. So I did a year of content where it was 2 posts a week for an entire running year. And it was Mondays and Thursdays. And it was really because I had fallen off of the schedule and I wanted to challenge myself. And like I did it. I actually averaged like 3.2 posts a week instead of the 2 that I had set out to do. I think just because I was anxious to hit publish a lot. So I'm writing about movies, or I'm writing about books, and I'm writing about sports, and just it was so much fun. And then podcasting happened and I started listening, and then you look for more to listen to. And that's like the nature of podcasting. Like you don't listen, as a listener, at least you don't listen to just one. Like you listen to one and then one of your favorite hosts goes on another show and you're like, well, I'll check them out. And then you like that show. And so it was just kind of that. And then as I interact with you on Twitter, I interacted with other shows back in the day. And that's how, you get drawn into a circle. And fast forward, I end up, guesting on a bunch of shows, and then even kind of being behind the scenes of a bunch of shows. And eventually I launched my own, but I mean, it all starts with a blog. In fact, I did a full like 37 minute solo episode 53, which is my quote unquote behind the microphone, which is the full unabridged journey of what I just gave you.
Yes, I did listen to that episode. That's a good one. And it's like 30 minutes long. So it's not some story that like I would have or draw out to like 3 or 4 hours. Anyway, man. So what about before growing up? So I know for me, like radio was big. What say you? You got obviously really into writing. I myself, I don't mind writing, but definitely not at the level where I feel like I could maintain a couple posts a week on a blog.
Well, so I love radio. I mean, I loved music, and I still do. And I played, if you could name a band that you can be in like middle and high school, I was in it. So marching, jazz, pep, all that. But also I was a bass player for a classic rock cover band, and also a bass player for a metal band. And then in college, I was the lead guitar, the only guitarist in a 2-man band. It was myself and another Jason who played drums. And I've always been a talker, though. Like it's one of those things where don't ask me how I'm doing if you really don't want to know. Like I will tell you, and then we'll just have a conversation. I mean, the show really isn't much more than what I would do if you and I had a meeting, right? Like I would just be like, we'd get the meeting part out of the way, whatever the business is, but then I want to talk to somebody.
You're that guy that you ask how they're doing at the gas station and they keep you there for 10 minutes. That's what you're saying?
I can easily be that guy. Yeah.
Everybody loves that guy for sure. So man, you started out with the blog. What are some of the first podcasts you remember listening to before you, even though you've been involved with them for a while now, what are some of the first podcasts you remember listening to as far as when we were all using the term podcast, if that makes sense what I'm saying?
I know that the first 3 podcasts I listened to, and they were all around the same time, was Nerdist, Marin, and Smodcast. What happened was I fell into somehow listening to 7 Days a Geek, which was my first true indie that I listened to. And I'm thankful for that happenstance, because at the time, co-host Grant Markham is launching or getting ready to launch the Stranger Conversations, which is my first guest appearance on a show. And I became friends with Jason the Angry Ginger because of that. And I got to be behind the scenes of that show for quite a while. And that show led me to all the other shows I've ever been on, really. And it's only in the last little bit that I've tried to be like, I want to get out of my circle. Like I've definitely fallen into a circle, and it's like I want to get on other ones, but that's the one. I blame Ginger for everything, because 7 Days a Geek is really the is really the hub that creates a lot of the spokes for me in indie. And then, I still listen to Marin, and Nerdist turned into ID10T, and I take it or leave it, and Smodcast has come and gone as well for me. But I think part of that is because I enjoy, it's not that I don't enjoy those other personalities, but indie is different. It's not the same. And it has that ring of like, well, I knew them before. Like I knew them way back when. And, I've written a post years ago at this point, but it still seems to be relevant all the time, is like, do you want your indie podcast to succeed? Like, do you truly want that? And what I find is the arguments for and against are the same as, do you want that indie band that you absolutely love, that you go to see every weekend in a club with like 50 or 100 other people? Do you want them really to sign the contract? Or do you enjoy seeing them at the small club and like being able to talk to them? Because when they sign the big contract, there's a chance they'll go multi-platinum and they'll only be playing arenas, and they won't have that community aspect that indie bands do when they start out. And it's the parallels to indie podcasting are very similar. And I know it's not the same. I know that it has changed a little bit since I wrote that maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but there's a part of me that believes as these indie podcasts grow, the amount of interaction they get with their audience stays about the same, but their audience grows, so the number of interactions grows, right? They still want to reach out to everybody, but when you're interacting with 50 people, each episode drop, right? As an example, you can do that. That's still humanly possible.
Yeah.
500, 5,000. Now you're talking now that's not possible anymore. And the thing about it, which is why I feel like some people secretly do hope their favorite podcast, indie podcast, remains indie, is because they enjoy being one of 50, and that's great. And even if you want to, you have to come to terms as a listener with the idea that if they do become super successful and they can do all those things, and you're trying to support them to that, then if you're going to be one of 1,000, one of 5,000, and you're not going to get that straight up creator consumer relationship just the same as it was when you were one of 50. And to me, it's one of the reasons that I gravitated towards the 7 Days a Geek at that time, and all of the other shows in that circle at that time. I mean, I can name a lot of them, but that was the first one that was really indie for me. And I don't get invited onto Grant's spin-off show, so to speak, if I'm not interacting with them. Right? Like I got that interaction with them, and I still have it with them. But again, I do wish Jay would go bigger. That would be great. But at the same time, and maybe it's different for me because I'm now friends with him. I can text him. This is not just a normal podcaster listener relationship for us anymore. But for those other shows that I'm a part of where I don't have that, I think I would miss it. I have no problem being selfish like that. Like Jeff, I wish you all the success in the world, but and I know that you can react and respond to me when I live tweet when I get the chance. But if you got huge enough, I would miss that. And I don't presume enough or think enough of myself as a listener to be like, well, if he had millions, he would still reply to me. No one thinks like that. At least I don't. So that would be something I would miss if you took that next step, right? And selfishly or not, I think that's something we all have to come to terms with, depending on when you fall into that indie podcast circle of that particular show that you love, right? I think it's a discussion that I don't think happens enough.
I agree with you. And I think there's always that risk also that when you get to that next level or you get out of what we're defining as indie, that there's a chance that your content would change too, right? Musically speaking, or even with even podcasts.
Yeah, I think that's the other piece of it, right? If you always have, I'll say this, if your lifestyle changes, your personality will change a little bit. Maybe not a lot, but a little bit. And so if you have a podcast based on lifestyle and your life experience, and you go from working 2 jobs and having a podcast for fun to just having a podcast, then your lifestyle's changed. And any residual stories you might have had about job A or job B, or about trying to make ends meet, that which makes you eminently relatable to your audience, go away when you're just making content, right? So there are sides to this that it's a little bit of, sometimes the worst thing you can get is exactly what you wish for.
No, I got what you're saying, Jason. I do. And I think for me, it is important for what I'm doing. It is important to be relatable. Now, granted, some of the podcasters I talk to are very, very small. I know I have by far more downloads, but I'm still relatable. I'm still one of them. And I think that's what makes this really work, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that you're talking creator to creator, right? And I like the idea, and I think we should push it much harder, that if you're a podcaster, you're a creator. Like, I did a poll, I don't know, within the last 6 months, saying like, I say content creator, and what do you think? Right. And the average, the winner on that poll was content creator equals YouTube. Right. And to me, that's not fair. To me, that's not fair, because I would love to say I'm a content creator, because it's easier than saying I'm a blogger and a podcaster. Like, I create content. I am a content creator, but that word has been basically hijacked by the YouTube creators out there. And I have no ill will towards them, but if there's a YouTuber that also has a podcast, they are a content creator, right? And so, you are creating something, and you have talked to podcasters, but the conversations you are having can also be had with an independent YouTube channel of somebody who's, just barely scraping by at whatever the new mandates YouTube is set for advertising revenue, right? And maybe they're only making $5 a month, but they're going through the same stuff we are as podcasters, and bloggers maybe have it a little bit easier for discoverability. And then YouTube, because obviously that Google algorithm is good for YouTube, and then podcast discoverability is a nightmare. So there's things we can learn from everybody. And I've always been a proponent, and Jeff, whether you want to admit it or not, I still think you should be blogging, because personally speaking, especially when I've been a producer on shows, the amount of stuff that goes unsaid on a podcast that is still relevant content that could be written into a small 500-word blog post. By the way, I finished editing this episode, and this is something I still want to say. Okay. And whether it's a conversation between you and me, or it's just a solo episode I'm doing, or maybe a group roundtable discussion, everybody's got something that they didn't say. Write it down. You don't have to record it. And if your audience is there, they'll eat it up. They'll be like, absolutely. Thank you for sharing this. And it's discoverability. You get into that SEO, YouTube algorithm. You get into the SEO algorithm stuff, and people read the post and go, what's he talking about? Link back to episode. Like the marketing ramifications of it are important as well. But I'm a big proponent of that. And that's not just because I'm a blogger first, or I was a blogger first. It's just because that's the way I feel. Because I've had those conversations, right? Like we're off air. We're done. Okay, great show. And then host A goes, I really wanted to say this. Well, write it down. I think that podcasters and maybe YouTubers to an extent too get in this habit of, this is my medium, right? I if I'm going to put something out, I need to record my voice. And you don't. Like, you really don't. I have a brand new audience. I do not presume that my blog audience and my podcast audience are the same. Despite the fact that my personality is the same with both mediums, I don't presume they're the same. But I also expect that anybody who's listening to this right now, who's never seen my blog, right, is going to go to agentpalmer.com and they're going to hear me when they're reading those posts. Just like if you read a famous biography or autobiography, you read it in the author's voice, right? So you don't need to put it out there on audio. And it's a way to create something and continue the conversation without everything else. And I know it's not that hard to create a podcast. I mean, it is to create a good one. The editing, the quality, all that stuff that we kind of stress over at times. But you don't have to worry about that. If you forgot to put something in the episode, write it down. It's 300 words. It's a few paragraphs. And then it's out into the world and you're continuing the conversation without having to go back in and toy with the episode, right? Or put out a 5-minute mini episode. You don't need to. Just write it down. And I feel like people need to get used to multiple mediums. And yeah, I'm biased because I'm experienced with it. I'm used to writing and recording.
I'm going to take a minute here to tell you about a fine sponsor of this podcast, Indie Drop-In. If you're a true crime, paranormal, scary, or comedy podcaster looking to find new listeners, consider submitting an episode to be featured on Indie Drop-In shows. If your episode meets some minimum requirements, Indie Drop-In will play your episode to real listeners. The best part is, the listeners like your show, Indie Drop-In provides easy links for them to subscribe. It's 100% free. You get to drop your feed into a established feed that already has actual real listeners. This is great, guys. This is an amazing way to grow your audience. These listeners are already there. They listen to your episode on Indie Drop-In feed. They will go over and find your podcast and become a subscriber and love it. Greg, the creator of Indie Drop-In, just absolutely loves being involved in the independent podcast community. He is a great podcast mind. Make sure you give him a follow on Twitter at Indie Drop-In. But more importantly, go to indiedropin.com/creators. Get the submission going and submit an episode of your podcast into the Indie Drop-In feed. Hurry now. Get to it.
It's a good reason. And you talk about CEO. And the thing that I always tell people, you really should have a website, right? Just for that sake. Let me give you an example. Speaking with this podcaster on Twitter who's new, he does not have his own site. And he signed up for one of these review my podcast behind a paywall thing that go on Twitter. You know what I'm talking about? Somebody has an account and a website. You pay them and they will review your podcast. Well, they review his podcast on their website. It's not exactly favorable. Guess what happens now when we all Google the name of his podcast?
Yeah, that you go to that unfavorable review.
He doesn't have a website. He has a link tree though. Well, that's not the same thing. It does not get you there. So when you look it up, that's what it shows for your podcast now. So it really is important. And that is a great idea that you mentioned, because adding additional resources to that and possibilities is huge.
Yeah, I mean, it's all there, right? I mean, we've all been there. I think it's better if you can preempt it, like when you're editing and you go, oh, I need to write this down. And, I have a process where I have an intro and an outro on my show that I can take care of some of those things if I need to. But worst case scenario, it's out there, it's published, and I'm going to write a blog post about it, right? Like I have that, and everybody else does too. They need to take advantage of it.
Going back a little bit more, like you said, the conversations that I have can relate to different things. And it has. I've interviewed illustrators, authors of books. And on the intro of this podcast, the theme song, I know you've heard because you've listened to the episodes, I say artist. And I've taken a little bit of criticism over that. But to me, this really is an art form. Let's say you.
Oh yeah, I mean 100%. And I actually take offense to the idea that anybody can do this, because I don't think anybody can do this. And I think I've shocked some people that have, maybe I've been networking, right? Or just talking to people and meeting people. And, we talk about certain things and they find out I have a podcast or that I'm in podcasting, and they go, well, we've been thinking about doing that for our company. And I have a list of a few questions I will ask them. But a lot of the time, especially in a corporate sense, you don't need your own podcast. You may want to get out there and have maybe somebody from your marketing department or your president and CEO out there, giving your message out to relevant podcasts. But if you only if you want to make a big push for push-ups, right? You're like a health organization and you want to make a big push for push-ups. Just go on like 3 podcasts and talk about push-ups as a guest, as an expert, right? You don't need to start your own show when you've only got 3 episodes that you can think of to talk about push-ups. And then what? And I think that there's this myth around podcasting that it's just as simple as grabbing your phone and hitting record. But it's not, because that's the reason we have all these dead podcasts. That's the reason we have all these podcasts that don't come through episode 10 or episode 12. And yeah, some of it's because if you just record on your phone, maybe the audio quality will be horrible. And a discerning podcast listener will know, like, well, I'm used to this level of quality. I can't go backwards. But at the same time, they want to invest in something. So maybe you do a 10 episode season or a 12 episode season, but you have to commit to something. We talk about podcasting still as the wild, wild west, in that there's still literally anything that can be done. And we don't know what the standards will be, right? They're still kind of mutating, but the listenership that exists right now is used to a certain level of quality. And they're also used to a commitment. If you're going to come to my show, if you're going to take the time to listen to any episode of the Palmer Files, know that there are others if you've never listened before, and that in 2 weeks' time, there will be another. And in a month's time, there will be another. And 6 weeks after that, there will be another. And if you are just on the outside looking in, saying, well, maybe we should just do a podcast, they don't think about these things. And we don't talk about them enough. People still think it's easy. It's just like, and maybe I take it a little too personally, because I have a blog and I always heard, well, we'll just have a blog because anybody can write. Well, not everybody can write well, though, and not everybody can keep it going. And podcasting is the same way. We need to give ourselves credit for the work that we do. And when we allow a myth to propagate, such as anybody can do it, just pick up your phone, record, and hit publish. While that is true, in the simplest terms, that's what you can do. When we allow that to move on and continue being spread around the world, then we're minimizing the work that we do. And we're minimizing the editing that we do. I take a 90-minute episode and try and edit it under 65 minutes if possible. So that way I can put my beginning and my end on, and I don't go over my goal. Like, I have a sweet spot. I'm giving you 75 minutes of content, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. I never want to go over 90. I respect your time too much. But all of that work I'm doing, I'm minimizing by saying, well, anybody can just pick up their phone and talk and put that out. But no, because you're doing more work than that, Jeff, and I'm doing more work. And the average person listening to this that has their own show is doing more work than that. And we need to take credit for that. Jason,
you hit the hammer on the nail, man. It's no secret, and I'm pretty public about the fact I don't have much of a plan when I go into all these recordings. And I'm fine with this kind of going off of the untraditional path of tell me about everything you've ever done, Agent Palmer. And we'll just keep the discussion going here. And I'm fine with that. I really am. They can do Another Day, Another Time, the life and death of Agent Palmer.
Well, I've already done. I mean, that's episode 53. I've already covered that. We can cover new ground, my friend.
You said podcast discoverability is a disaster, which it's definitely not as far along as it should be. Why do you think that is, and what do you think's wrong with it, and what do you think could improve it?
I'm going to get on my soapbox for a moment. This is my hot take. There's no money in podcasting. So when I write a blog post, if I want to super optimize that post for maximum searchability, I can do that by stuffing a few keywords and phrases in, and it goes on my website where I can put Google AdWords, or I can host the Microsoft ad network. I can host other ad networks, and I can get 1,000 people to look at that. And if I'm running all 3 ad networks, I can get a cost per click or a cost per impression on those 1,000 listeners. I mean, on those 1,000 viewers of my blog, right? Of that particular post. And on YouTube, there's pre-roll that we have to skip through or we're forced to watch. So the powers that be, Google, the big one, right? The main search network of everything. Google gets to make money on all those things. So there's an incentive for them to make sure that you find my blog post because, they're the biggest ad network there is. So there's a chance one of their ads will be served when they do that, ignoring the paid search completely. I'm not even talking about that. Organic, this is the best thing. Maybe there'll be an impression. And most sites run that kind of advertising. And because YouTube has that pre-roll, maybe even a mid-roll or something, again, there's money in it because the text on the site for my blog is so searchable and easily searchable. And because YouTube videos, we can build an algorithm for, this is great, but these are 2 specific platforms. One is the web at large, and the other is YouTube, which is a platform. And there's money in both. So we want searchability, and we want discoverability, and we want recommendability as much as possible. Podcasting's not that way. Audio has not done that. And I don't know if we will ever get the searchability and discoverability and recommendability that we want out of an AI that we get in text form and in video form, because there's just no money in it. And because there's no centralized platform. So how are you listening to this episode, right? Are you on Jeff's site? Are you on Spotify? Are you on Apple Podcasts? Are you on Pocket Casts? Are you on Stitcher? Are you on Good Pods? Maybe, right? Good Pods and Stitcher and Spotify have an incentive to make discoverability on their platforms. But again, it comes back to money. They're not Google. And if Google wanted to take all that they know and all of those algorithms, the reason YouTube search is what it is because they leaned on the Google search for discoverability. And until there's money in it, we're not going to get there as a medium. And I feel it's very much doom and gloom for me, but at the same time, it allows a show like yours to hold more water because other creators are listening. And they might like what I'm saying, or they might like what so-and-so or somebody else says, and then we'll go check it out that way. And so discoverability is a problem and searchability is a problem, but recommendability, that we've got down. To me, if we could make it so there was more money in it for the outside powers, right? I'm not talking about you making money. I'm talking about somebody else making money because then discoverable. And look, there are people making strides for it. I don't want to minimize their effort.
And there's a lot of attempts, Jason, for audio discoverability and different apps and different engines and different things to try to do that, but it hasn't worked. You're right.
Yeah. Until there is a uniform, I just don't see it happening, which also means that podcasting will probably remain, quote unquote, underground. It will never be as big as my blog as a platform or YouTube as a platform, which I'm okay with. Like I'm all right with it being, slightly left of center. But on a whole, discoverability needs a financial incentive for the powers that be that would be great at doing discoverability.
You bring up a good point because it probably will always have the independent theme, even if, and people always say that podcasting used to belong to the little guy, the independents. Mostly true. And if you get the big celebrities that are getting into it and everything.
I mean, the one thing I will give to any celebrity who's taken their agent's advice to start a podcast is thank you. We'll take your listeners when you're bored, right? Because like the amount of podcasts and celebrity podcasts that have popped up, especially when, the actors had not much else going on, people that are taking it seriously, but there's a lot who aren't. And to them, I still say thank you, because you're the hardest part for podcast discoverability is podcast understanding. And it's getting someone to download or open Apple Podcasts or download Stitcher or Good Pods, or like it's getting over that hump. And because there's so many, people are like, nah, I won't bother. Right. I've got a friend who likes my show, but laments the fact of listening to it. And then I was like, well, I do host my every episode on YouTube. And he's like, well, I'll listen there. Right. And to that extent, if Celebrity X wants to start a show that I know is going to go away when you get your next television gig, then hopefully your listeners will find someone else's show because they'll be used to listening. And that's good. But I think that the regular podcast listener, the person who will identify as a podcast listener, not a fan of show X, but the person who's got way more subscriptions than they need to on whatever app they choose to use, they're going to find those new shows and they're going to sense, is this real or is this person just going through the motions? And we've seen some shows be blips because the people listening to your show right now, Jeff, they can tell a fake, right? They absolutely can tell a fake.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully they can get more people into the platform from a listener standpoint because they've got the name recognition. And then when they go away, that void can be filled by an independent, hopefully.
It's a positive outlook on it, Agent Palmer. I'll give you that. Let me ask you another thing here.
Yeah.
When, in your opinion, are you no longer indie? What qualifications meet and make you indie? And when do you officially lose that?
I think it's different for everyone because I feel like it depends on what you want to do. I mean, I look at it a lot like punk rock. When you start to go along with the system, that's when you have a problem. Like you can take their money. I don't think money makes you not independent. When I say there, I'm just, general corporateness, right? But I think that it's what you choose. It's your personality. Like I am who I am. And if I went quote unquote corporate, if I stopped being indie, you would be able to tell. I would be different. My show would be absolutely different. And I think a lot of it boils down to a sterilization of content. And to me, that's probably the one delineation, right? When you go and you sign an exclusive deal and your content changes, you're no longer independent. But I don't think it's based on money. Like I still consider and people, I'm on Twitter at Agent Palmer. Hit me up if you don't like this. But I still see Hardwick with at ID10T specifically and Marin as independents because Hardwick may have a little staff, but now he's doing it on his own since he sold Nerdist, right? And Marin, it's just him and Brendan. It's two people.
Yep.
It may be very successful, but it's two people. And if you're going to tell me two people just because they make a lot of money and they were they were there from the beginning, if you're going to tell me they're corporate, then we're going to have to talk. Because I do not believe that success merits independent or not. And they're independent because it's just the two of them. They don't have corporate overlords. Mark can say whatever he wants and talk to whoever he wants. And now Chris can too. I feel like at the end of Nerdist, it was a little different, but there's your difference. That's what I think it is. So I think it's about that punk rock. This is who I am. Deal with it. And when you get paid to be somebody else, you're not independent anymore.
The reason I ask you that is somebody actually tweeted that at me earlier today, and I need to respond still. To me, the lines really get blurred, and you pass that qualification when you no longer own your content, right? Let me give you an example. True Crime Garage, massively popular true crime podcast. Always in Apple top 150, always near the top of the true crime. Those guys own and operate out of the house still. They own their content. They distribute it. I mean, they own what they're distributing, if you know what I'm saying. They have sponsors.
Yeah.
They make money, but they're still independent of everything. They own it. And that's, to me, they're still an independent podcast. And that's not what people like to hear a lot of time.
You know why they don't like it? Because people who make money make people, and it's the money. It's the money discussion, right? Because people, especially when we talk about independent podcasting, maybe more than any other independent creator thing, you're supposed to come home from your 9 to 5 and deal with whatever you have to deal with at home, whether it's mowing the lawn or the kids or your wife or your boyfriend or your partner or a second job or school. And then you're going to do your podcast. And when all those other things are secondary, especially the job, when the job is the podcast, that's a personal trigger for some people to go, well, you're not independent anymore. But to me, independent, I think of like independent cinema, right? Like,
yeah,
the distribution's not that great because it's not coming out of Paramount, but it's also very unique and it's something different. And that's what we want from independent podcasts.
And these are the kind of conversations that we have on Twitter. I mean, or we have online. That's why it's going to make this episode a little bit unique, but good. What are some things you see independent podcasters doing that you don't exactly think may be a good use of time? And what things do you see that you think we could avoid a little bit better? And what do you suggest doing?
So there's a couple answers, right? The first is talk about reviews. I've never been one to care about reviews because to me, I understand that reviews are important, but as we talked about discoverability, not everybody's audience is in the same platform. Like if you look at your metrics, right, you can go, I really need some Good Pods reviews, or I really need some Apple reviews, or I really need some Spotify reviews, right? Like you can tell where your audience is. I don't care about that personally, because to me, I want you to live tweet my show. I want you to tell me you're listening. You took the time to hit play. Great. Tell me you're listening. That's it. And if you want, because this is how it happened for me, and it's not the same for everybody, but this is how it happened I told people I was listening. I'm going to be concrete with this. I told 7 Days a Geek I was listening to episode 98, 102, wherever I started. I think I was 104 maybe. And Jason the Angry Ginger tweeted back to me. And I also happened to tag Grant, and Grant tagged me back too. And I had conversations with them about the one episode as I was listening to it. But that only happens if Jason, Agent Palmer, as a listener, tweets from the @Agent Palmer account to 7 Days a Geek, right? And so eventually we become friends, and I infiltrate the show, and I become a producer, and I was a co-host for a little bit, and yada, yada, yada. But all of that is to say, that doesn't come from a review. And to me, it's more lasting. I know reviews are important, and I don't mean to diminish them. But if we could just get people to communicate, hey, I'm listening. And it's whatever platform you happen to be on. I just use Twitter because that's my main platform. It's the one I've chosen. If you're on Instagram, take a screenshot with your phone, because most of the time you're probably listening on your mobile device, and tag them, I'm listening to your show, right? If you're on Facebook, you can @ them, right? Like there are ways, no matter the platform. And that starts a conversation. And I'm nothing against reviews, but reviews are one way. And I don't want one way. I want two way. So if you are a podcast creator who barely has time to listen to the shows that inspired you to start your own show, right? Or that your friends are doing, listen to one less show a week. Make that sacrifice and let those other ones know you're listening. Yeah, every hosting platform tells you what your numbers are when you log in. Okay. But you know what? That's fine. And we all appreciate the wallflowers, right? But if I find out that 10 people listened to my show yesterday, even though I didn't release one, that's cool. But if one of the people tweeted me, that means a lot. And I can reach out to that. And everybody talks about having interaction with your audience, but you need to engage your audience. And that starts with us. So Jeff, when you're listening to a show, make sure when you listen to my show, tell me. And you don't have to have a thing. It could just be, I'm listening to. I've done it for you basically since episode 1, right? Like I'm behind, but I'm just catching up. You know when I'm listening to your show. And I do that because I want to do that. And I feel like it's good. Other people see that I'm listening to this, and maybe they'll jump into the conversation if it's an interesting conversation. Maybe it won't get you listens. Maybe it will. Who knows? But that interaction means an awful lot. And I don't know if we do a good job of that because we're all busy asking for reviews, which are great, but I'd rather have the conversation. I think we've established that. I'd rather have the conversation, whether it's on mic, on Twitter, or at the gas station. I'd rather have the conversation. And I don't know if people do enough of that. And the other part is, and this is for you've been listening to a show for a while and you really like it. Don't be afraid to reach out. DM them. Hey, is there anything I can do to help? And I'm not talking money. I'm not talking Patreon. Maybe they'll be like, yeah, can you help promote the show a little bit? Or, hey, we're having a content meeting next week. Do you want to come in? If you ask, the worst they can do is say no. But you'll be surprised. The Palmer Files doesn't exist if I don't tweet 7 Days a Geek when I'm listening and get pulled into that circle. It just doesn't. And there are other such butterfly effects along the way, but that interaction really went a long way for me into the behind the scenes there and other shows. And it all starts because I reached out. I said, hey guys, I'm listening. And they loved it. They loved it. To me, that's something special. Now, look, I know my father listens. Okay. How do I know my father listens? Because he calls me and he tells me, hey, I really liked your last episode. Or, hey, that guest, that was an interesting story they told. My father's not on Twitter. So that's his equivalent, is literally picking up the phone and calling me. The point is, a review is good, but it's a one-time thing. But if you can continue to uplift these creators, like Jeff, like me, like anyone else, on the same basis that they uplift you and give you something to listen to, that's important. It's community, yes, but it's literally a bond. So that's one. I mean, it's a lot right there, but that's one. And the other, in regards to email and getting email from the show, and I can't reiterate this enough, a lot of podcasts, especially like your conversational roundtable ones, ask for emails, listener feedback, right? Email the show. We'll read your email live on the air, or we might read your email live on the air. If somebody takes the time to email you, even if you don't plan on using it for the show, reply. I know it sounds so basic, but I'm going to tell you a story because I feel like I haven't told enough. And I feel like Jeff's going to have the longest episode ever now. But when you talk about my early days of 7DAG and tweeting with the guys, I was what you would call an egomaniac at a certain point when it came to early podcasting. I would email all of the shows I listened to see how many I could get to say my name on air. And a few years ago, there was an app that I was very sad to see go, called Clamor. And yes, Headliner does a good job, but the best part about Clamor was if it was in Apple Podcasts, you could literally just clip the thing and share it immediately. And I used to, for promo purposes, for them and for me, if I wrote an email to the Wicked Theory podcast and Bill said my name, I'd pull the clip and I'd post it on Twitter. And if I wrote in a couple things and they read my email on air, I'd clip it. And if I wrote in to 7 Days a Geek, I'd clip it. Reasons Are Several, I'd clip it. Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, I'd clip it. Our liner notes, I'd clip it. These are the shows, right? There's more of them, but these are the shows in the very beginning. Diamond Mines, Inglorious Gentlemen, Podcast Without Borders, Moving the Needle. All of these shows I emailed and they read my name on air and I clipped it. I'm not a podcaster at this point. I'm just an avid fan and probably a bit egotistical, but still there are other shows since then that I have emailed where I never hear back. And I understand not every email you send is going to make it. I became friends with all of those shows. They never read every email I sent, but they always took the time to reply to my email, even if it was just a thanks for the email. But it's not automated. And I knew it came from whoever was doing, whoever's manning the email account. Because Jeff, I know you're a solo effort and I'm a solo effort, but not everybody is. They divide up the work as you should, but reply to the email. That's it. Because when we talk about building community and when we talk about marketing and promotion, that interaction, that's everything. Like that's the golden ticket. Because not only is it somebody saying, I'm taking the time and I'm reaching out, but they like you if they're going to reach out, or they hate you, but they still listened and they're reaching out. That interaction means a lot. And look, I'm not one for numbers. And I think maybe part of that's because I've been a blogger for so long. And I remember 10 years ago launching the blog and going like, one person saw my post today. Woo! I've grown from that. So I don't look at my podcast statistics, but I definitely know when somebody tweets at me. And that means more. And I think for me personally, it always will. And I think deep down, there's a lot of people listening to this that go, yeah, it would be great if more people would tell me they were listening. Like, yeah, we can all see the statistics, but we want to know who you are. Just like you're listening because you want to know who we are or what we're telling you. I mean, those are the quick things, man. Let people know you're listening, and hopefully your listeners will see that, especially on a platform like Twitter. Like your listeners are following you. So they're going to see you say, hey, podcast father, I heard you and Agent Palmer talking on Indie Podcaster. Palmer doesn't know what he's talking about.
Screw Palmer.
Screw Palmer, but I still enjoy the episode, right? They're going to see that. And maybe they're going to be like, hey, you, I listen to your show. Like that, look, do what I do. Do what I do. Right. And there are times I miss an episode here and there for tweeting, but for the most part, and this is the scary part about it, I can't hide whether I'm listening to your show or not, because I've pretty well established if I'm listening to your show, I'm tweeting about it. So if I fall off, you'll know. And that can be scary to people, but it means the world to the people that you do reach out to. That's all.
No, that's such a great point, because engagement is really what makes this all work. None of this would exist at all in any sort of relevance if there wasn't engagement. That's beautiful, Agent Palmer.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I mean, thanks for giving me the pulpit, so to speak. I'll get off my soapbox now.
You are sipping on some, I don't know what kind of special medicine you have for this sore throat that you have, but you're definitely going to be not able to talk after we're done with this one, huh?
Coffee. Always coffee.
Man, this has been a great conversation. I may have to pick up again sometime. This is great stuff, and I think the people listening will take something away from this. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you again? I think that's good. That's important, because I'll be honest, you and I have discussions like this, and you're constantly tweeting about and discussing things like this. It's valuable information, man.
And I can't believe I didn't do this to you, but I'm going to give you a piece of advice, which is, before I give my particulars, which is, if you want people to interact with you, if you want me to live tweet your show, make it easy and tell me what the Twitters are up front. And if you want me to email the show, tell me up front, because listening to your show, I go, well, I know now as a regular listener, I know everybody. I know Indie Podcaster. I know Podcast Father. I know what your ats are, but I don't always know what your guests is. So I have to do a little search before I can do the tweet. So make sure you say that up front. But for me, and it's all up front in all of my shows, but, and we all have to pick our battles, but for me, it's just at Agent Palmer, right? Or the show at the Palmer Files. And concurrently, The blog is agentpalmer.com and the podcast is thepalmerfiles.com. And, available everywhere or probably wherever you're listening to this, but reach out. And if you don't if for some reason you don't want to hit me up on Twitter, theagentpalmer@gmail.com, and I will respond.
Lovely. Suggested follow and engagement with everybody with Jason, aka Agent Palmer. You might even learn a thing or two. One way or another, you will have a great discussion. Hey man, thanks again. And I really do appreciate all the support. It means a lot, and I really do appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for listening, and thanks for telling a friend. More importantly, thanks for supporting independent content creators. I hope you get behind me with what I'm trying to do, highlighting great things all sorts of content creators and other interested individuals are doing. Join me on the next episode as I continue my journey as the indie podcaster.